The cabin looked like a mistake covered with tarpaulin. Seen from the dirt road that cut through the woods, the structure clashed with everything expected of a functional house in that region. The dark, old and cracked logs were wrapped in a second skin of thick fabric, stretched like a poorly constructed tent over a building that no longer inspired confidence. The autumn wind made the tarpaulin creak, producing a dry, irregular sound that seemed to confirm all the jokes whispered in the village. To passers-by, it wasn't ingenuity. It was desperation disguised as improvisation. And the woman who lived there, thin, with her hair tied up under a worn-out cap and her hands always busy adjusting ropes and stakes, was seen exactly as someone who insisted on doing everything the wrong way. No one directly said she was doomed to failure, but the heavy silence of the neighbors said it all. The region knew only one way to face the extreme cold: solid wood, a constant fire, and resignation to the high consumption of firewood. Anything that deviated from this was seen as dangerous stubbornness. She wasn't trying to convince anyone. She just kept working, adjusting the tension of the canvas at specific points, creating small folds that seemed to serve an invisible logic. When someone asked what she was doing, she replied with technical brevity. She was creating an air layer between the canvas and the wood. The answer didn't help. For others, air didn't heat anything. Air was empty. What heated was fire. Thick walls, dense insulation. The idea that a fabric barrier could make a real difference sounded like the fantasy of someone who had never faced a real winter there. But she had. And that was precisely why she was doing this. The previous winter had almost driven her out of the place. Sleepless nights shivering under all the blankets she owned, firewood burning too fast without managing to heat the room, cold drafts seeping through invisible cracks. The memory still burned like ice on her skin. The central paradox of the story was there, exposed and misunderstood. That which seemed most fragile, fabric stretched over wood, would ultimately prove more efficient than traditional structures that had withstood generations. But no one knew this yet, and perhaps it was better that way, because the approaching winter would be different, longer, more aggressive, and the only thing between her and the lethal cold would be precisely what everyone ridiculed. The canvas creaked again in the wind, and she pulled another rope, adjusting the tension with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to make a mistake. There was no second chance. There was no alternative plan. There was only the silent certainty that, when the snow really started to fall, that strange structure would be tested to its limit. The cabin sat at the edge of a narrow valley, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked some of the wind but also trapped moisture in the air. The terrain was sloping and rocky, with moss growing in the permanent shade and roots protruding like exposed veins. During autumn, the ground exuded a smell of decaying leaves mixed with cold resin. Sunlight rarely reached it directly. Always filtered, always gray, always carrying the promise that the cold would arrive sooner than anywhere else in the region. The cabin itself was small, built decades ago by someone who probably didn't plan to stay. The logs were of uneven thickness, joined together with mortar that had already crumbled in several places. There was no interior lining. The wooden roof was covered with rusty metal shingles that groaned under any snowfall. Before the tarp, every gust of wind transformed the interior into a chamber of uncontrollable cross-currents. She had inherited the land from a distant uncle who had died, leaving little more than debts and a piece of land that nobody wanted. There was no real choice. With no money to rent in the village, no family willing to help, she accepted the land as a last resort. She arrived in the middle of a humid summer, believing she would have time to prepare. But the winter of that first year came early, and she wasn't ready. The nights were a series of failed attempts to keep warm. Blankets piled high, clothes layered on top of each other. The fire kept burning until the wood ran out before dawn. She would wake up with numb hands, her face burning with cold, and the certainty that she wouldn't be able to repeat it. Her body held the memory of each shivering dawn, of each breath that ached in her lungs. When spring finally arrived, she vowed she would find a solution. Not an expensive solution, because there was no money, but a solution that worked. The village was 7 kilometers away, accessible by a dirt road that turned to mud during the rains. She went there once a week to buy the bare necessities and sell small handicrafts she made. Baskets, fabric repairs, occasional tasks that no one else wanted to do. The conversations were always brief. She wasn't part of any social circle. She didn't attend meetings at the community church. She didn't participate in meetings about collective road maintenance. Not out of arrogance, but because she knew she wasn't seen as an equal. She was the outsider, living in the abandoned cabin, the strange woman who preferred isolation. When she first mentioned the idea of covering the cabin with a tarp, the reaction was immediate. Restrained laughter, exchanged glances, comments that seemed kind but carried disbelief. An older man, the owner of a sawmill, said that wood needed to breathe. Another stated that tarps were for camping, not for dwellings. She thanked them for their opinions and moved on. The isolation wasn't just geographical, it was emotional, built on the difference between those who had resources and those who needed to invent solutions. The other families in the region had solid houses, some with adequate thermal insulation, others with wood or oil heating systems that, although expensive, worked. They could afford to follow traditional methods because they had a margin for error. She didn't. Every mistake cost sleepless nights, compromised health, real risk. That's why she observed everything with different attention. She measured the internal temperature at different times. She tested where the wind entered. She noted how long the firewood lasted, depending on how the fire was managed. She read about thermal insulation in old books she found at flea markets. And that's how she discovered the concept of an air layer, a barrier that didn't need to be dense, only capable of retaining heat through trapped air. The feeling of always being watched was constant. Even alone on the property, she knew that any visible change would be noticed by anyone passing by on the road, and the tarp was impossible to ignore. Stretched over the cabin, it created a strange silhouette, almost comical to those who didn't understand the logic behind it. She felt the weight of that silent judgment. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered the grocery store. She felt it in the glances of disguised pity. But she also felt something stronger, the certainty that she couldn't go back. Because if winter returned as before and she hadn't done anything differently, the result would be the same. And she wouldn't survive another winter like the previous one. Not physically, not emotionally. The decision to cover the cabin wasn't daring. It was absolute necessity disguised as a strange experiment. The decision to cover the entire cabin with thick tarpaulin didn't happen overnight. It was the result of weeks of observing how the heat escaped, where the wind was strongest, and how the log structure behaved under different weather conditions. She measured the internal temperature at strategic points, noted the variations between morning and night, and realized that the problem wasn't the lack of heat generated by the stove, but the speed at which that heat dissipated. The old logs had microscopic cracks, the mortar had disappeared in several joints, and the roof allowed cold air currents to pass through like invisible blades. Rebuilding the cabin would cost more than she had. Insulating with conventional materials was also out of reach. But creating a second skin, a barrier of stretched fabric that trapped a layer of air between it and the wood, was financially viable. The tarpaulin cost less than treated wood. And if it worked, the savings on firewood throughout the winter would pay for the investment. It was a logical gamble. For her, at least. For the community, it was madness disguised as desperation. When she started assembling the structure, the reactions were swift and direct. A neighbor passing by in his pickup truck stopped just to say that the tarp wouldn't keep out the cold at all, that the wind would tear everything apart in the first real storm. Another commented that moisture would get trapped between the tarp and the wood, rotting the logs in less than a year. At the grocery store, the owner asked with a tone of someone who already knew the answer, if she wasn't afraid of creating a stuffy and unhealthy environment. A man who claimed to be experienced in rural construction was even more direct. It was an improvisation by someone who didn't understand how the cold worked. He stated that wood needs to breathe, that oversealing was as bad as not sealing at all, and that she was wasting time and money on something that was nothing more than a poorly constructed tent over a house that was already problematic. She thanked him politely and continued working. The installation process took almost 3 weeks. She began with the side walls. fixing wooden stakes 15 centimeters from the logs, creating an empty space that would be filled with air. The tarp was thick, made of water and wind-resistant waxed fabric, the kind used in industrial roofing. She stretched it precisely, using ropes tensioned at calculated angles to prevent the wind from creating pressure points that could tear the material. In the most exposed corners, where gusts usually hit hard, she folded the tarp and reinforced it with additional strips. The roof received an extra slope so that the snow would slide off instead of accumulating. The entrance gained an improvised double chamber, 2 thick tarp curtains separated by a meter, creating an intermediate space where cold air would be retained before entering the cabin. Every detail had a specific function. Nothing was decorative. Everything aimed to reduce heat loss and maximize the retention of internally generated heat. The jokes started even before the structure was complete. Someone nicknamed the place a circus tent. Another said it looked like a cabin wrapped as a gift. A group of men drinking at the village tavern made bets on how long the canvas would last. Some gave it a week, others a month. Nobody believed it would last until the end of winter. The ridicule wasn't aggressive, but it was constant. Loose comments, restrained laughter, glances that mixed pity and amusement. For them, it confirmed what they already thought. She didn't understand the place where she lived. She didn't respect the methods that had worked for generations. And she was trying to reinvent something that didn't need changing. The consensus was clear: solid wood, strong fire, resistance to cold. Any deviation from that was seen as an error in judgment, and covering an entire cabin with canvas, creating what looked like a tent superimposed on a permanent structure, was the kind of decision only someone inexperienced and stubborn would make. She listened to everything in silence. She didn't try to explain the thermal logic behind the choice. She didn't show the calculations she had made. She didn't argue that trapped air was one of the best natural insulators. She knew that words wouldn't change her opinion. Only results would. And the results would only come when winter truly arrived. Until then, she would remain the strange woman who covered the cabin with tarpaulin, the outsider who insisted on doing everything wrong. The risk perceived by the community was twofold. Not only would the structure fail, but she herself would suffer the consequences of not having followed sensible advice. When the cold truly set in, when temperatures dropped below zero for weeks on end, that tarpaulin would be tested under extreme conditions. And everyone expected, with a mixture of curiosity and anticipated certainty, to see it fail. Because in the minds of those who had lived there for decades, tradition existed for a reason. And challenging tradition without recognized authority was asking to learn the hard way. The real preparation began after the tarp was installed. Covering the hut was only the first step. The system would only work if every internal detail was adjusted to work in conjunction with the external barrier. She started with the floor. The wooden floorboards had wide gaps between them, through which cold air rose directly from the frozen ground. Using compacted sawdust mixed with clay, she filled each crack, creating a layer that blocked the passage of air without adding excessive weight to the structure. The work was slow and dirty. Her hands were covered in dried mud, her knees ached from crouching for hours, but she continued methodically, making sure that no gaps remained open. After sealing, the floor was covered with thick mats made of woven rags, adding another layer of insulation between her and the cold coming from below. Every inch mattered. Each barrier, however small, reduced the amount of heat escaping and increased the efficiency of the system as a whole. The wood-burning stove was old, made of cast iron, with a chimney that went straight up through the roof. She realized that much of the heat generated was being wasted and went up the chimney without adequately heating the room. To correct this, she installed a heat diverter, a curved piece of metal that forced the smoke to travel a longer path before exiting, transferring more heat to the interior air. She also added stones around the stove, which absorbed heat during the day and continued to radiate it at night, even after the fire had died down. The firewood was stored inside the cabin in an area separated by a thick curtain. This served two purposes. The wood dried better, burning more efficiently, and the pile of firewood itself acted as an additional barrier against the cold that entered through the back wall. Nothing was accidental. Every choice stemmed from observation, testing, and continuous adjustment. The double-entry chamber required special attention. She created a transitional space between the exterior and interior, using 2 heavy canvas curtains separated by a meter. When someone entered, they would open the first curtain, enter the intermediate space, close the curtain behind them, and only then open the second curtain to access the heated interior. This system prevented blasts of cold air from directly invading the main room. The intermediate space functioned as a kind of improvised airlock, where the cold air was trapped and slowly mixed with the residual heat, instead of displacing all the warm air at once. In initial tests, she realized that this method drastically reduced heat loss whenever the door was opened. It was a detail that seemed excessive to an outside observer, but it would make a real difference when the cold became constant, and opening the door meant losing precious heat accumulated over hours. The windows were few and small, but they still represented points of heat loss. She couldn't replace them with double glazing, so she improvised. She covered each window from the inside with a layer of stretched transparent plastic, creating an airspace between the glass and the plastic. On colder days, she planned to add thick curtains that could be closed at night, completely blocking out the cold. During the day, when the sun appeared, rare but possible, she would open the curtains to capture any available solar heat. This balance between sealing and taking advantage of natural light required constant attention, but she was willing to make the necessary adjustments. Each window was tested individually. She lit a candle nearby and observed whether the flame flickered, indicating a draft. Where there was movement, she sealed more carefully, using strips of fabric soaked in wax to close the gaps between the frame and the wall. Ventilation was a legitimate concern. Oversealing could create a buildup of moisture and smoke, making the environment unhealthy. To avoid this, she installed 2 small, controlled openings, one near the ceiling to allow hot, humid air to escape when necessary, and another near the floor on the opposite side to allow minimal fresh air in. Both could be completely closed during periods of extreme cold, but under normal conditions, they remained partially open, creating slow, controlled circulation. She tested the system by deliberately burning damp wood to see if the smoke would be properly evacuated. It worked. The air circulated without creating cold drafts, and moisture did not accumulate on the walls. This delicate balance between insulation and ventilation was something that traditional methods rarely considered, because large, well-built houses had room for waste. She didn't. Throughout the weeks of preparation, she kept detailed notes. She measured the internal temperature at different times, compared it to the external temperature, and calculated how long the heat remained in the room after the fire was reduced. The numbers were consistent. The tent, covered by the tarp and with the internal adjustments, maintained an internal temperature about 15 degrees higher than the outside, even with the fire low. This meant a huge saving of firewood. It meant sleeping through the night without waking up shivering. It meant that the system, however strange it seemed, was working exactly as she had planned. But the numbers didn't matter to those looking from the outside. To them, it was still a poorly constructed tent over an old hut. And until winter truly arrived, until the cold tested everything under maximum pressure, she would remain just the strange woman who insisted on doing everything the wrong way. She spent the last days of autumn stockpiling firewood, organizing provisions, and reinforcing the points that still seemed vulnerable. The tarp was inspected inch by inch, each rope checked, each knot tested. She knew there would be no second chance. If something failed during a strong storm with sub-zero temperatures and violent winds, she wouldn't be able to fix it. She would have to endure it or abandon the place. Therefore, every detail was checked 2-3 times. The stones around the stove were positioned to maximize heat absorption. The woodpile was arranged for easy access even in the dark. The rugs were adjusted to cover all areas of greatest heat loss, and the entry chamber was tested repeatedly to ensure it would function intuitively even when she was exhausted and cold. Everything needed to be simple, functional, and resistant, because winter didn't forgive unnecessary complexity. When the first light snowfall came in late October, she observed how the tarp behaved. The snow slid down the slope she had created, accumulating around the base without overloading the structure. The wind blew strongly during the night, making the tarp crack, but no rope broke, no anchor point gave way. In the morning, she went out and walked around the cabin, checking every detail. Everything was in place. The system had passed its first test. It wasn't yet the real winter, it wasn't yet the cold that truly mattered, but it was a sign that the preparation was correct. She went back inside, closed the curtains of the entrance chamber, and felt the immediate contrast. Outside, the air cut her skin. Inside, the heat from the stove kept the environment stable and breathable. The difference was undeniable. Now all she had to do was wait for winter to truly arrive, and prove that silent preparation was worth more than noisy tradition. The cold arrived earlier than expected. By early November, temperatures were already dropping below freezing at night, and frost covered everything at dawn with a thin, shiny layer that took hours to melt. The sky remained gray for days on end, and the wind carried a metallic smell that heralded heavy snow. In the village, conversations changed tone. They stopped talking about harvests and road maintenance and focused on stockpiling firewood, checking heaters, and preparing homes for the prolonged winter. Some residents began burning firewood earlier than usual, anticipating the worst. Others reinforced window and door seals, following traditional methods: strips of cloth soaked in pitch, additional wood nailed over visible cracks. Extra layers of insulation were possible. The region knew that harsh winters occurred in cycles, and all signs indicated that this would be one of the worst in years. Preparation was not optional. It was a matter of survival. In the canvas-covered cabin, the first signs of threat came in the form of small, unexpected challenges. One morning, she woke up and noticed that the air's humidity had condensed on the inside of the canvas, forming droplets that slowly trickled down to the floor. It wasn't a critical problem, but it indicated that the balance between insulation and ventilation needed adjusting. She slightly opened the controlled ventilation vents, allowing the humid air to escape without losing excessive heat. The problem lessened, but didn't disappear completely. She noted the observation. On days with high humidity, it would be necessary to increase ventilation for a few hours, even if it cost her some heat. It was a necessary compromise. Another problem arose with the firewood pile. Some of the wood she had stored wasn't completely dry yet, and it burned inefficiently, generating more smoke than heat. She separated the dry firewood from the wet wood, reorganizing the stock to ensure she always had access to the best fuel available. The wind began to test the structure more aggressively. Strong gusts came from the north, battering against the side wall of the cabin and making the canvas vibrate with a deep, constant sound. During one particularly violent storm, she stayed awake all night, listening to the fabric crack and waiting to hear the sound of something tearing. But nothing broke. The ropes held, the anchor points held, and by morning the structure was still intact. Still, she went out to inspect it. She found 2 spots where the tension had loosened slightly, allowing the canvas to tremble more than it should. She adjusted the ropes, reinforced the knots, and added extra stakes in the most exposed corners. Each storm was a test. Each test revealed small flaws that needed to be corrected before they became big problems. She knew she couldn't expect the structure to be perfect from the start. She needed to observe, adjust, adapt. And that meant being constantly vigilant. The snow began to fall intermittently. Nothing too heavy yet, but enough to cover the ground with a white layer that didn't completely melt during the day. The sloping tarp worked as planned. The snow slid and accumulated around the base of the cabin, forming an additional natural barrier against the wind. But this also created a new problem. The accumulated snow partially blocked the lower ventilation opening, reducing air circulation. She had to go out several times to clear the area around the opening, ensuring that the airflow wasn't completely interrupted. It was tedious work, done with hands already numb from the cold, but necessary. Inside the cabin, the temperature remained stable, but she noticed that firewood consumption was slightly higher than expected. It wasn't alarming, but it indicated that something could still be optimized. She adjusted the heat diverter on the stove, forcing the smoke to travel an even longer path before escaping through the chimney. The first real signs that the winter would be brutal came when a neighbor knocked on her door, not to ridicule her, but to warn her. He said that forecasts indicated severe temperature drops in the coming weeks, possibly reaching 20 degrees below zero, and that winds of up to 80 kilometers per hour were expected. He recommended that she check if she had enough firewood and if the cabin was truly prepared. His tone wasn't mocking, but genuinely concerned. He still believed the tarp wouldn't hold, but he didn't want to see her in danger. She thanked him for the warning and assured him she was prepared. When he left, she stood in the entry chamber, feeling the cold coming from outside and the heat remaining inside. The difference was brutal. Even with the increasing cold, even with the first signs of real threat emerging, the system was working. But she knew that the real tests were yet to come, and that when they arrived, there would be no room for error. The first real storm arrived in the second week of November. The sky darkened at midday, and the wind began to howl through the pine trees with an intensity that made the tallest trunks visibly sway. The temperature plummeted in a few hours, dropping from 5 degrees above zero to 10 degrees below. The snow didn't fall in light flakes, but in horizontal bursts that hammered against any exposed surface. Inside the cabin, she turned on the stove and completely closed the ventilation openings, prioritizing heat retention over air circulation. The sound of the canvas cracking was constant, almost deafening, but the structure held. Outside, visibility was zero. The world was reduced to white and gray, wind and cold. She knew this was only the first of many storms to come, and she also knew that while she was relatively protected, other houses in the region were beginning to face real problems. Winter had arrived in full force, and it would not let up. In the village, the first reports of hardship began to circulate. A family living in an old house, similar to her cabin but without any additional reinforcements, had to temporarily abandon the building because the internal cold had become unbearable. Even with the stove constantly lit, the temperature did not rise above 5 degrees. The children woke up crying from the cold during the night, and the adults spent the entire day feeding the fire without managing to heat the environment adequately. They moved to relatives' house in the village, leaving their own residence empty until winter passed. Another resident had his water pipe completely frozen, cracking the pipes and leaving the house without water. He tried to thaw it using hot water, but the damage was already done. Without running water, he had to manually fetch water from a community well, carrying heavy buckets through the snow several times a day. These were problems that, in normal winters, would be inconvenient. That winter they were becoming crises. Firewood consumption in the region skyrocketed. Families who had planned to stockpile until March realized within a few weeks that they would need far more fuel than anticipated. The price of dry firewood rose dramatically, and some residents began burning green wood out of desperation, generating excessive smoke and little heat. Electric heaters, used as backup in some homes, overloaded the local grid, causing intermittent power outages that left entire houses in the dark and cold. Each power outage meant restarting wood-burning stoves that had been left on standby, losing hours of accumulated heat, and starting the heating process from scratch. Exhaustion was visible on the faces of people going to the grocery store. Everyone seemed to be sleeping less, eating worse, and moving more slowly. The constant cold drained physical and emotional energy, and it was only the first few weeks of winter. Spring was still months away. Meanwhile, in the canvas-covered hut, the situation was completely different. The internal temperature remained stable between 18 and 22 degrees, even with the fire at its lowest point during the night. The temperature difference between the outside and inside reached, at times, 45 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read 23 degrees below zero. Inside, she could walk without a heavy coat, sleep with a light blanket, and work on small tasks without her hands going numb. Firewood consumption was a fraction of what traditional houses were burning. Where others needed to feed the fire every 2 hours, she could keep it low for 6 or 7 hours without the temperature dropping significantly. The stones around the stove absorbed heat during the day and continued to radiate it at night, keeping the environment warm even when the flames diminished. The layer of air between the canvas and the logs worked exactly as planned, as an invisible insulator that retained the generated heat and blocked the outside cold. But nobody knew that. To the community, that strange cabin was still a joke. Some even commented with feigned concern that she was probably suffering as much as everyone else, perhaps even more, considering she lived in a precarious structure covered by a tent. Nobody knocked on the door to check. Nobody offered help. She was seen as someone who had made foolish choices and was now reaping the consequences. And perhaps it was better that way, because if they knew she was comfortable while they struggled against the cold, the reaction might be disbelief, anger, accusations that she was exaggerating or lying. Collective pride was still intact. They still believed that their traditional methods were superior, that the problem was only the unusual severity of that particular winter, not the structural inefficiency of the buildings they occupied. Admitting that such a simple and ridiculed solution could work better than decades of tradition was something nobody was ready to accept. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, it left behind a scene of silent destruction. Roofs had accumulated too much snow and collapsed in places. Trees fell on fences and sheds. Roads became impassable. The village had to organize teams to clear the main roads, using tractors and shovels, working in shifts because the cold prevented anyone from being exposed for too long. Several residents developed symptoms of mild hypothermia, numb extremities, mental confusion, profound exhaustion. The local nurse was overwhelmed attending to cases of burns caused by desperate attempts to warm up near overheated stoves, and cases of carbon monoxide poisoning from those who had oversealed their homes without adequate ventilation. The winter wasn't just testing structures. It was testing bodies, minds, the collective capacity to resist. And it was only the first few weeks. She emerged from the cabin after the storm passed, using the path she had cleared through the snow to reach the outside firewood pile. The tarp was intact, covered by a thick layer of snow that slowly slid away as the sun reappeared. No ropes had broken, no fastening point had given way. The structure had withstood winds that had toppled centuries-old trees, and it remained firm. She checked every detail, adjusted small tensions that had loosened, and cleared the accumulated snow around the ventilation openings. Everything worked. Everything was exactly as it should be. She went back inside, closed the curtains of the entryway chamber, and felt the warmth envelop her like an embrace. Outside, people were suffering. Outside, the collective consensus still believed she was in the same situation or worse. But the truth was undeniable. While traditional houses failed under the pressure of the extreme cold, that strange cabin covered by a ridiculed tarp was functioning perfectly. The second storm arrived just 4 days after the first. Then came the third. Winter settled in as a constant and relentless presence, without respite, without pause. Temperatures rarely rose above freezing during the day and plummeted brutally at night. The wind never completely stopped. Snow piled up in waist-deep layers in open areas, and with each passing day, the difference between those who were prepared and those who were not became more evident. Traditional homes consumed firewood at an unsustainable rate. Families rationed food because they couldn't go to the village often. Children fell ill. Exhausted adults made mistakes. They left fires burning unattended, ventilated poorly and breathed smoke, went out without adequate protection, and returned with frostbite. Winter was winning, and everyone knew the worst was yet to come. She kept noting everything down. Internal temperature, firewood consumption, stove efficiency, the behavior of the tarp under different conditions. The numbers were consistent. The system worked. But the numbers didn't matter as long as no one else knew about them. As long as she remained isolated, just another resident fighting the winter, the truth would remain invisible. And perhaps it would remain so until the end of the season. Perhaps no one would ever discover that this ridiculed solution had worked better than any traditional method. But winter had other plans. Because at some point, when the cold became unbearable, when conventional solutions completely failed, someone would need help. And when that happened, collective pride would finally begin to crack. Because survival always speaks louder than tradition. The ordeal began with a hesitant knock on the door. It was night, and the wind howled outside with a force that seemed to want to tear the hut from the ground. She was about to sleep when she heard the muffled sound of someone tapping on the outer curtain of the entryway. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. No one would come there at that hour, in that cold. But the knocking continued, more insistently. She got up, went through the inner chamber, and opened the outer curtain. On the other side was a man she vaguely knew from the village, one of those who had joked about the tarp months ago. He was visibly shivering, his face red with cold and his lips almost purple. He said that his house heater had broken down 2 hours ago, that he had tried to fix it but couldn't, and that the internal temperature had dropped below 0. His wife and 2 small children were wrapped in blankets, but they couldn't stop shivering. He had come to ask if they could spend the night there, just until dawn, when he could get help from the village. His voice was low, heavy with shame. He was asking for shelter in the very place he had ridiculed. If you're following this story, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this deserve to be shared. She didn't hesitate. She told him to fetch the family immediately. While he ran back through the snow, she prepared the interior, pushed some furniture into corners, spread blankets on the floor near the stove, and added firewood to increase the heat. 15 minutes later, the family entered the double chamber. The woman carried a baby. The man held the hand of a boy of about 5. They were all wearing several layers of clothing, but they were still shivering. When they crossed the second curtain and entered the heated room, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The woman stopped, her eyes wide, and murmured something that sounded like disbelief. The man stood still, feeling the thermal contrast, and for the first time looked around with real attention. The heat inside wasn't just perceptible, it was impossible to ignore. While outside the temperature was 25 degrees below 0, inside it was 20 degrees above 0. The difference of 45 degrees was palpable, physical, almost shocking. The children stopped shivering within minutes. The family spent the night in relative silence. The children slept near the stove, wrapped in blankets. The adults stayed awake longer, still processing what they were feeling. Sometime in the early morning, the man asked how this was possible. She explained it simply. The tarp created an air barrier that retained the heat generated by the stove, preventing it from escaping through the cracks in the wood. The double entry chamber prevented the cold from entering when the door was opened. The stones around the stove accumulated heat and continued to radiate it even after the fire died down. Everything worked together. It wasn't magic. It was basic physics applied with precision. The man listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said nothing. He simply nodded slowly with an expression that mixed understanding and something akin to regret. He had mocked it, and now he was alive and warm because of it. In the morning, when the wind died down enough to allow movement, the family prepared to leave. Before leaving, the man thanked her with short but genuine words. He said he would tell the others what he had seen. She hadn't asked him to do so, but he said it anyway. As they left, she stood in the entrance chamber watching them disappear down the snow-covered path. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not with speeches or public acknowledgement, but concretely. Someone had needed help, had asked for it, and had received it. And in the process, had seen with her own eyes that this ridiculed structure functioned better than any traditional house in the region. The collective pride, so firm for months, had begun to crack. It was just a small, almost invisible fissure, but fissures grow under pressure, and winter was not yet over. The news spread quickly. The man who had taken shelter in the cabin told other residents what he had seen, and although some still reacted with skepticism, doubt began to replace absolute certainty. 2 days later, during a particularly violent snowstorm, another family appeared. This time, they didn't ask for temporary shelter. They came because the roof of their house had partially collapsed under the weight of the accumulated snow, making half the building uninhabitable. They needed a safe place until they could arrange repairs, and someone had suggested the canvas-covered cabin. She welcomed them without hesitation. The family brought their own blankets and some food, settling into a corner of the already occupied space. The environment became more cramped, but the temperature remained stable. The stove continued to function with brutal efficiency, consuming firewood at a much slower rate than would be necessary in any other building. The surrounding stones radiated constant heat. The outer canvas kept out the wind. Everything worked together, exactly as had been planned months before. On the third night, with the second family sheltered, the storm worsened. The wind reached speeds no one in the region had seen in years. Trees were uprooted. Shed roofs flew off like sheets of paper. The electricity went out completely, leaving the entire village in darkness and cold. Houses that relied on electric heaters became vulnerable within minutes. Families huddled together in a single room, trying to conserve body heat under piles of blankets. Some tried to use generators, but fuel was limited, and the constant noise of the engines added another layer of tension to the chaos. During the night, 2 more people knocked on the cabin door. An elderly couple whose house had completely lost its heating and who were at real risk of hypothermia. They arrived exhausted, almost unable to speak, trembling uncontrollably. She helped them inside, placed them near the stove, offered them hot tea and dry blankets. Within minutes, color returned to their faces. The shivering subsided. They were safe. The cabin, which had been designed for 1 person, now housed 9. The space was cramped, almost claustrophobic, but no one complained. Because inside, even with 9 bodies vying for space, the temperature remained between 19 and 21 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read 27 degrees below zero, with an even worse wind chill. The difference was almost 50 degrees. If those people hadn't been there, they would have been exposed to potentially fatal conditions. Some houses in the region had already reported cases of frostbite. A child had developed severe pneumonia. An older man had fainted from the cold and needed to be rushed to the hospital. The winter wasn't just being harsh, it was being lethal. And the only thing preventing those 9 people from becoming more victims was precisely the system that everyone had ridiculed months before. During the early morning hours, with everyone trying to sleep on the cramped floor, she stayed awake watching. The stove burned low but steadily. The stones continued to radiate accumulated heat. The outer tarp crackled under gusts of wind that made the entire structure tremble, but it didn't give way. Every element she had planned, tested, and adjusted was working under maximum pressure. The double intake chamber prevented icy air from entering directly. The airspace between the tarp and the logs retained internal heat. Controlled ventilation prevented dangerous smoke buildup without wasting heat. The sealed floor blocked the cold rising from the frozen ground. Everything was connected. Everything had a purpose. And everything was saving lives at that moment. There was no heroism in it, just meticulous preparation that finally paid off the investment of months of silent and ridiculed work. Sometimes it's like that. You do what needs to be done, even when nobody believes in you, and when the time comes, it makes all the difference. By morning, the storm had subsided enough to allow limited movement. People began assessing the damage to their own homes. Some would be able to return with basic repairs. Others would need more extensive help. But everyone was alive. Everyone had survived the coldest and most dangerous night of the winter so far, and none had suffered serious injuries. Before leaving, each person expressed their gratitude in a different way. Some with formal words, others with silent hugs, others simply with looks that said it all. The elderly couple wept. They said they didn't know how to thank them, that they probably wouldn't have survived without that shelter. She didn't know what to say. She only said that they would have done the same for her. But she knew it wasn't true. Months ago, no one would have done anything for her. Everyone had left her alone with her strange idea and her tarp-covered shack. But now, after a night where survival depended precisely on that ridiculed structure, something had changed permanently. When everyone left, she was alone again. The cabin was a mess, bearing the marks of several people's occupation. She began to slowly organize, gathering blankets, adjusting furniture, tending to the stove. Outside, the world remained white and silent. Snow covered everything in thick layers. The wind had left visible marks, broken branches, snow piled up in strange patterns, signs of destruction everywhere. But the tarp was still intact. The ropes still held. The structure had withstood winds that had toppled seemingly much more solid buildings. She went outside and walked around the cabin, checking every point of tension, every knot, every fastening. Everything in place, everything working. The system hadn't just worked, it had worked perfectly, under extreme conditions, with maximum pressure, saving 9 lives in a single night. If anyone still doubted it, now they had concrete and irrefutable proof. Winter continued for another 2 months, but something fundamental had changed. The people who had sheltered in the cabin shared their experience with others, and the information spread organically and inevitably through the village. There were no public speeches or official recognition, but the way the villagers looked at her when they saw her in the grocery store was different. There were no more jokes about the tarp. There were no more ironic comments about the tent-covered cabin. Instead, there were practical questions. Some wanted to know exactly how she had assembled the structure, what type of tarp she had used, how she had calculated the distance between the fabric and the logs. Others asked about the double entry chamber, the stones around the stove, the controlled ventilation system. She answered patiently, explaining each technical detail without pride or resentment. There was no need to say that she had tried to explain before and no one had listened. The facts spoke for themselves. During the rest of the winter, 3 families in the region adapted their own homes using variations of her method. None managed to completely replicate the system, but all significantly reduced their firewood consumption and increased thermal comfort. The idea that seemed absurd months ago was becoming common sense. When spring finally arrived, the tarp was still intact. 5 months of storms, violent winds, heavy snow, extreme temperatures, and the fabric remained firm, without significant tears, without critical points of failure. She decided to keep it installed, not only because it worked, but because she now knew with absolute certainty that it would work again the following winter. The cabin, once seen as a precarious and temporary construction, had proven itself more resistant and efficient than houses that cost 10 times as much to build. The community didn't offer formal apologies, and she didn't expect them to. But the silent respect was evident. When she needed help with some repairs on the property, neighbors would show up without her having to ask. When she went to the village, people would stop to talk, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine interest. She ceased to be invisible. She stopped being the strange outsider who lived in isolation, doing incomprehensible things. She came to be seen as someone who knew how to solve problems in unconventional but effective ways. And this change, though subtle, fundamentally altered her position within the community. The legacy of that season went beyond personal survival. The solution she had developed out of sheer necessity ended up influencing how the region thought about thermal insulation and protection against extreme cold. The following winter, more homes adopted variations of the method. Some used reinforced tarpaulins, others experimented with different materials, but all followed the same principle, creating a layer of air that retained heat instead of relying solely on thick walls and a constant fire. The collective savings on firewood were significant. Families who previously spent their entire winter budget buying fuel managed to reduce consumption by half or more. Children who previously fell ill repeatedly due to excessive cold spent entire winters without serious respiratory problems. The quality of life improved measurably, and it all began because one isolated woman, without resources, ridiculed by her community, decided she would not repeat the suffering of the previous winter. She decided to think differently, test hypotheses, trust basic physics instead of blind tradition. And when the critical moment arrived, when lives depended on that strange decision, she was prepared. Stories like this remind us that innovation often arises from necessity, and that those who are discredited today may be supporting everyone tomorrow. If this story touched you in any way, follow the channel. Sharing accounts like this keeps alive the idea that thinking differently can save lives.